All right, and thank you all for being here, and welcome to the February 26th presentation for the iSchool, the School of Information here. So sorry, at the University of Arizona, and our iSchool colloquium series called Information Matters. And I'll toss over the microphone to you, Zach. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm very excited about the talk today. We have Dr. Aaron Trammell, assistant professor of informatics and core faculty of visual studies at UC Irvine, just a few hours west of us. He graduated from Rutgers University School of Communication and Information in 2015. Good school. I graduated from the program, so I'm a bit biased. He spent a year at the Edinburgh School of Communication at USC as a postdoctoral researcher. And Aaron's research looks at the persistence of analog games in today's digital world. He's interested in how political and social ideology is integrated into the practice of game design and how these perspectives are negotiated within the imagination of players. He's currently the editor-in-chief of the journal Analog Game Studies and the media editor of Setting Out. Dr. Trammell, take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm invite. It's so nice to see you and some other familiar faces in the room, which I did not expect. So that's kind of a treat. And it's also really exciting to share new work. So the work I'm showing is kind of work in progress. It's under review with the press right now. So I'm hoping that this is going to be kind of a mix up of the introduction and some foundational chapters in the book that I'm presently working on. So I'm really excited about your feedback. It's really new work, and I'm just interested in what you have to say about it. So I'm going to try and do a share screen. Make sure this works. Okay, so you all should be seeing my slides. Great. All right, so before I get going here, the one thing I want to talk about here is that there's going to be roughly 2 parts to this talk. And in one part, I'm going to be doing some definition work. And the other work, I'm going to be diving deeper into historical materials. And the reason I say that up front is because I'm kind of working on history here in the Foucauldian tradition. And in Foucauldian genealogy, there's 2 things that you look for. The first is emergence, that's family resemblances. So for here, that is the familial resemblance of hobbyists from gaming communities and the games they made to other games in society today. I hope to make a case for that, and also hobbyists in the ways they committed to other groups of hobbyists today. And then the other thing you look at is, I'm sorry, that's descent. And then the other thing you look for is emergence, which is where you look for moments of political friction, right? Like moments where people don't agree and new things come out of the material that might not have been seen at the time. I'm going to get more into the emergence side in the second half of the talk, but we're going to start more with the descent, looking at familial resemblances and making a case for why the emergence is important. So that's kind of the context of the work here. All right. The 2002 board game Puerto Rico asks players to develop sugar, tobacco, coffee, and indigo plantations as they settle and develop the island of Puerto Rico. Players work their plantations with small brown discs that resemble colonists. These discs come from cardboard boats that are filled every round. Puerto Rico isn't an obscure game. It was ranked #1 between the years 2003 and 2008 on the site Board Game Geek. It's #1. Its enduring popularity marks it as one of the most influential board games ever designed. And since its publication, the game has vexed fans seeking to redeem it from the obvious subtext. In Puerto Rico, you play a slave owner exploiting the labor of your slaves for fun and profit. Now, countless threads on online forums grapple with the racial subtext of Puerto Rico. One Board Game Geek user wrote in 2014 that they were concerned to share the game with a Black friend. The game's defenders, trying to whitewash history, circulated a popular argument that Puerto Rico abolished slavery in 1873. Therefore, they believed it was inaccurate to view the game simply as a slave plantation simulator. Others still were dumbfounded. In a Reddit thread entitled Puerto Rico, the Racist Game, a user described their discomfort when encountering the game in a board game cafe. Candidly, a representative from the game's US publisher, Rio Grande Games, said that racial representation in Puerto Rico is one of the top customer service topics that the company fields. This is Rado. He's a board game reviewer today. So these discussions speak volumes about the discomfort gaming hobbyists have in confronting their own racism and how ardently they protect their own whiteness. Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, points out this defensiveness only makes the problem worse because, quote, we then feel the need to defend our character rather than explore the inevitable racial prejudices we've absorbed so that we might change them. In this way, our misunderstanding about what prejudice is that which protects it. So in the example here, one user glibly suggests that the player with a black friend simply paints the colonist tokens green. This suggestion was followed by another. Just replace them with small plastic statues, as if the problem lay in simply representing blackness with brown tokens. Later, the thread devolved into a conversation that interrogates the taste of the black friend in question. Are they offended by the black robber token in Settlers of Catan? Is the Fred educated enough to recognize that Puerto Rico offers a historically accurate simulation of the slave trade? Richard Ham, pictured here, once the creative director of The Sims, offers the penultimate comment. He noted that the colonist tokens, unlike slaves, could work in the local university or other town businesses. For that reason, and I quote, doesn't that make us just a little bit racist for assuming that the tokens represent slaves because they're brown colored, end quote. The original poster eventually explained that their friend said that the colonist tokens didn't bother him. But regardless, he wouldn't buy the game because unfortunately he had no friends which he could play it with who wanted to play it with him. So this is from Red Bank, New Jersey, where I grew up. This is the hobby store. It just closed down in January because of COVID. Meet the hobby game scene, where the conversation above is typical. Game hobbyists discuss, debate, and demonstrate the importance of tabletop games to their everyday lives. In the process, they assemble people from radically different social spheres. Hobby games include board games, card games, and role-playing games. They scrape by razor-thin profits and are distributed almost exclusively through a network of comic book stores, toy stores, bookstores, and hobby stores. Unlike big-budget games, hobby games are often the passion projects of players and developers. The members of this community refer to themselves as hobbyists. Hobbyists participate in analog gaming, a catch-all I use to refer to all non-digital games because it's simply intrinsically fulfilling and people go into them not for fame or fortune. Yet I argue that these are not just noble pursuits. They perpetuate unjust racial dynamics. Puerto Rico, the example above, demonstrates how the values of whiteness pervade the hobby game scene. It highlights how the invisible and taken for granted racial norms that circulate between players and desires exclude people of color from the hobby. This is a popular image about the internet from about 10 years ago. So today I want to argue that the story of hobbyists in North America helps us to understand the normalization of whiteness in digital media. Digital media, which is often lauded for its bottom-up participatory nature, was developed from the tools, skills, and values incubated in hobby communities. While we know that these communities were keen to embrace a rugged, scrappy, and inventive kind of masculinity, the less told story here is how the cultural norms of whiteness defined the social milieu. Indeed, just as the early internet was defined by stories of lonely white men reaching out to form community over telephone wires, the story of hobbyists began with lonely white men forging community through the mail. The contribution here that I make is historical. I want to argue to you that the hobby game community over time was shaped by the invisible norms of whiteness. And in this process, I want to highlight how the ideals, dreams, and practices of hobbyists inform the landscape of digital culture today. So this is the logo of Board Game Geek, the top site for understanding board games. It's the older logo. The top left is jokingly called by the community the Aryan logo. It got turned into the bottom right logo after a controversy blew up on Twitter recently. So hobbyists see themselves as outsiders, a dynamic influenced by a sedimented set of historical decisions made by white men while cultivating this community. I consider the geek and thus geek culture as a bellwether for the cultural ramifications of digital media, and I use a definition of geek identity that privileges its outsider status, engagement with popular media, and tech savviness. I argue that an interest in these domains strongly correlates with the conditions of one's upbringing. So are very often the interests of white men who grew up in the suburbs. So in this sense, the story of hobbyists connects to the decisions, desires, and cultures of white men in North America to digital geek culture today. The influence of hobbyists is wide-ranging. To understand it, we must begin with the ideas that were fostered by the hobbyist community. In particular, I'm interested in tracing how white privilege, an invisible and taken for granted social dimension of social influence, has historically afforded hobbyists the social, technical, and cultural capital. I conceptualize white privilege as a distinct from the related concept of hegemonic masculinity, the cultural system that normalizes this series of masculine ideas that maintain patriarchy. Hegemonic masculinity and white privilege overlap in the figure of the hobbyist and yield a set of seemingly paradoxical values. Hobbyists see themselves as outsiders because they have been empowered by white privilege, yet feel excluded from the domain of hegemonic masculinity to which they feel entitled. Also, they are tech savvy because these skills are all shared within a space of supportive masculinity, yet they often feel stuck in their careers because they position themselves as outsiders and thus miss many of the opportunities afforded to those who have embraced a typical white sociality. Thus, white privilege and hegemonic masculinity have incubated the outsider status of hobbyists. And to give you a slide demonstrating why this might be important, rather than take the outsider status for granted, it might be constructive to start by thinking about how those working in the tech industry see themselves as insiders. Their insider identity is informed by the normalization of whiteness and hegemonic masculinity. Kishonna Gray, Safiya Noble, and Ruha Benjamin have all argued that the insiders who constitute the tech industry embrace a culture of white masculinity. So I look towards hobby games and hobbyists to ask, is this definition alone adequate? In order to recuperate a more complete genealogical understanding of white masculinity in geek culture, I argue that we must understand how the hobbyist discourse of casting oneself as an outsider has produced a cultural dynamic unique to our culture's most conservative fringes. Through such a genealogy between hobbyist and geek, I show the complex and often counterintuitive ways that racialized subjectivity is produced, normalized, and made invisible. My historical work shows that unlike the Irish who cast themselves as white in order to gain social privilege in America's racist society, hobbyists see themselves as outsiders. The denial of white male privilege established by hobbyists continues to define the socio-technical space of geek culture today, even as it attempts to embrace a fuller source of diversity. And I bring this slide up, right, because I think that this speaks to the ways that geek culture and the conservative fringes of society have an alignment at times, right? And also clearly see themselves as an outsider to the insiders making decision in politics. Scholarship on geek culture often situates privilege merely as a problem of masculinity. In her book, Raising the Stakes, T.L. Taylor investigates why geek masculinity is a dominant cultural dynamic in esports, while Anastasia Salcher and Bridget Blodgett extend her arguments to television viewing and popular culture to argue that geek identity contains the toxic and hurtful dynamics. For this reason, Suzanne Scott positions the figure of the geek girl as challenging the hegemonically masculine space of geek identity. While this scholarship charts a path forward for understanding the politics of geek identity in the contemporary cultural milieu, I believe that it only tells half the story. The above work often implies that masculinity equates to white masculinity. The geeks described by these authors are aggressive, vulgar, and condescending, specifically because they resent being cast as outsiders. They resent not being given the social advantages typically afforded to insiders. Yet they are successful because the cultural dynamics of white privilege and hegemonic masculinity have allowed them to thrive. And the slide here is a slide from College Humor that at least goes over what a good stereotype of the geek girl or the fake geek girl here and the sort of like hegemonically masculine geek identity are. So I thought these were two polarizing things, but also in reifying these stereotypes, College Humor plays into the very problem they're seeking to undermine. This is a map of white flight on the bottom, the top left, and on the bottom right is a map of diplomacy, the board game, zines about that in America in about 1970. That's white flight in America, circa 1970 also. The areas that are more blue are the areas with more white flight. White flight set the stage for politics of white privilege to thrive. White privilege is often defined as a set of concrete material advantages that are socially given to white people. Like Sarah Ahmed suggests in The Cultural Politics of Emotion, I argue that white privilege is what she terms a happy object, a concept that is important because it hints at a promise of a futurity. Explained differently, the hobbyist experiences white privilege as a promise of the material lived conditions that are owed to them. The hobbyist outsider identity is informed by a desire for and an orientation toward white privilege. White flight thus exemplifies a mass movement towards white privilege too. Despite this movement, the ideals of white privilege were more frequently believed than achieved. The hobbyists continued to pursue white privilege in the domains of design and the domain of imagination. And so the outsider politics of geek identity map almost perfectly onto the conservative politics of the white communities that migrated from urban centers to the suburbs in the 1960s and 1970s. On a national level, this migration was driven by constitutional laws governing fair housing and public space. Laws like the Fair Housing Act and rulings like Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka were vilified by white communities. They positioned themselves outside the egalitarian mainstream of politics by adopting libertarian rhetoric of freedom. Likewise, geeks also started to see themselves as outsiders with interests beyond the mainstream. The demography of geek identity maps onto that of white flight. This alignment shows that geeks' outsider identity may have been influenced by a kitchen table rhetoric that imagined white communities occupying a similar position as that of the state. Because geek identity emerged from the white suburbs, the history of white flight in the US helps us understand the idiosyncrasies of hobbyist identity. In 1948, President Truman ordered that the US Army desegregate, a process slowed by internal pushback from military leadership. Eventually, in 1954, the Army had been completely desegregated. That same year, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against segregation in public schools in Brown versus the Board of Education. The Civil Rights Act followed 10 years later in 1964 and prohibited discrimination by race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. These institutional reforms set the stage for 1968's Fair Housing Act, a law that outlawed segregationist tactics. These tactics include publishing advertisements indicating a racial preference, refusing to rent or sell housing to the aforementioned groups of people, restricting access to community services, and intimidating or forcing non-white people to vacate their housing. These institutional reforms toward a more equitable nation were the result of civil rights activism in the US, which was almost exclusively described by the mass media as, quote, race riots. So white flight describes the mass migration of white people from urban centers to the suburbs following desegregation. The academic identification of causes of white flight was initially spotty, uneven, and by today's standards, kind of problematic. In Martin Grodnitz's early writing, he described it as a phenomena of tolerance, something that happens when a white population loses patience with their non-white neighbors. This framing supported a common narrative that desegregationist policy was enacted as a way to address racial segregationist perspectives like those held by the KKK. Grodnitz's narrative positioned white communities who left urban centers as merely the victims of an overreaching federal policy agenda. Kevin Kruse, an author who works on white flight in his book White Flight, criticized this policy-driven history of white flight for considering only radical segregationists as opposed to the grassroots dynamics that organized the social fabric of mass white migration. For Kruse, the dynamics here of white flight and white supremacy cut deeper. They were driven by everyday acts of racism that still constitute the fabric of many white communities. So I want to elaborate on this Kruse's hypothesis by offering examples of how grassroots hobbyist organizing parroted many of the social dynamics of white flight that Kruse observed. For instance, Kruse's writing describes how many conservative politics were informed by grassroots media and radio broadcasts, something we still see today. These broadcasts modeled techniques for masking white racism under a veneer of libertarian politics that advocated for personal freedoms. Importantly here, freedom is a dog whistle for white-dominated spaces and policies. Hobbyists shared similar practices and visions of freedom within their community. They sent messages through the post office, advocating for their personal liberties as they pondered the next move in their diplomacy games. White flight here is the single most important factor in catalyzing what I describe as a hobbyist subjectivity. The invisible rhetoric of white flight reflected in a hobbyist subjectivity continues to inform hobby game communities today. And so I want to draw on the explanatory power of the concept of white flight, positioning the term as an affect and a set of lived conditions. White people enjoy better mortgage rates, more just treatment by the police, better jobs, and the freedom to speak their mind without freedom of retaliation. Richard Dyer explains how the invisibility of whiteness results in structural privilege. As long as, quote, As long as race is something only applied to non-white peoples, as long as white people are not racially seen and named, they function as a human norm. Other people are raced, whites are just people. Thus, from a structural standpoint, white privilege derives from whiteness being positioned as invisible and outside of discussions about race. To have race is to be non-white. To be white is to control the conversation around who is visible and who is not. So, back to geeks. The history of geek identity's exclusionary tendencies is rooted in the predominantly white communities of gaming hobbyists that preceded it. By considering the historical role of hobbyists in the development of computer technology, game design, and popular media, I want to chart a path toward understanding the deeply rooted structural obstacles that have stymied a more inclusive politic. Behind each hobby game is a geek or team of geeks masterminding its development. And what better site to consider the intersection of game, geek, and media than hobby games? They're currently enjoying a moment in the sun, but have also been the creator infrastructure of digital game design since Rogue, Ultima, and Pong. And seen in this picture, you can see kind of how Dungeons and Dragons begets the dungeon crawl Rogue, begets the early dungeon crawl Ultima, begets games like Skyrim. This stuff is everywhere, and the mechanics in these games are in all of the games that we enjoy and play today. And so, although digital game designers often cite hobby games as their inspiration, the relationship between analog and digital game design worlds is far greater. Digital game designers are also hobbyists. Many, like Richard Ham, who was wearing the Black Lives Matter shirt in the image above, are active participants in the hobby game scene and thus purveyors of this culture. And again, he's important because he's the creative director of The Sims. So returning to geek identity, the history of computing also recalls geek within a lineage of hobby tinkers that dates back to ham radio operators, model rocket developers, and model train enthusiasts. This lineage eventually connects with personal computing in the late 20th century. Kevin Driscoll does some excellent work on this, but I'll just go briefly over this here. When expressing the economic imperative to develop a software industry, a young Bill Gates famously penned, quote, an open letter to hobbyists. Before identifying as a geek, Gates identified as a hobbyist. Yet the importance of hobby games in this history is largely understated. If we cannot understand the cultural values of geeks without understanding their history of hobbyists, we cannot understand the culture of hobbyists without dwelling on their culture, values, and beliefs. Hobby games tell the rich story of how hobbyists have long existed alongside what we now call tech culture and highlight the assimilationist and libertarian tendencies that have largely insulated them from the mainstream game industry. So the example I will highlight today shows how hobby gaming in the 1970s highlights how the community's suburban mindset was a holdover from segregationist policy and white flight. Following this, I'll take a closer look at a publishing loop, I'll call it the New York Conspiracy, in order to show how the hobbyist identity oscillates between the dynamics of white guilt and white privilege. It is important to understand the geography of this network so that we can better appreciate the network structure of hobbyists. Specifically, the structure echoes a similar distribution that would be made famous years later as the internet facilitated a similar communication between personal commuting hobbyists using BBS systems or bulletin board systems to communicate. Here, the community is fraught with conservative undertones driven by the white assimilationist politics of the hobbyists. Hobbyists, and by extension, hobbyists, promote themselves with a rhetoric of inclusion. They insinuate that all are welcome to participate, and this participation can be a healthy route to personal growth. Inclusion, in this context, is often accompanied by assumed and invisible norms of whiteness for fans who participate in the community. While the hobbyists in these spaces often want to broaden participation in their community, they simultaneously display a profound ignorance about where the norms of their community come from and why they are daunting for both women and people of color to navigate. So I'm going to briefly show you a time lapse of hobby game zines from my website. And this is the very one that I kind of showed you the image of from before that maps onto the areas of white flight. So here it is. Every dot is a hobby game zine that appears on this map, and it's talking to about anywhere between like 20 and 200 other hobbyists across the country who will then eventually create other hobby game zines, and the network will grow. And so this is around 1970. The network looks like this. And then you'll see it again bloom and blossom in like 1980. As in some of these spaces, right, you'll see the hobby network really taking off. So I think that's really important for the analysis I'm about to give you. All right, back to the slides. So this was all postal diplomacy. Okay. Though postal diplomacy informed the framing and context of the hobby, there were specific geographic regions and cultures that remained insulated from the hobbyist gamer space. In the visualizations we just viewed, there's a mark for every instance of a diplomacy fanzine in North America. This lets us infer where hobbyists were not: rural areas in states like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, and South Carolina. This is likely because hobbyists who were not in the network could not find the network. The Avalon Hill General's opponent wanting column helped connect hobbyists in helping them find one another. However, hobbyists who did not order a copy of that magazine through an advertisement in an Avalon Hill game they purchased, or who had no local hobby shop to purchase game magazines in, were unlikely to gain entry into this vast network of like-minded players. In this presentation, I want to also argue that gaming hobbies do not just take root elsewhere for other reasons, white flight in specific. So, back up to the white flight. This is the white flight in Indianapolis, Indiana. The white flight that followed desegregation from the 1940s and 50s set the stage for a predominantly white suburban backdrop in the 60s and 70s. Meanwhile, civil rights protests in the 60s and 70s took place within predominantly urban Black communities. In his book, White Flight, Cruz argues that the politics of white flight were a political revolution for the Republican Party. They encouraged white conservatives to craft a new, quote, a new conservatism predicated on a language of rights, freedom, and individualism, end quote. The very same keywords that white libertarian hobbyists deployed within their network. The context of white flight set the stage for politics of a hobbyist within the diplomacy fan community, as they were often white transplants in urban spaces confronted with the tumultuous vibe of civil protest. At first, zines were often clustered in urban areas with colleges like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, DC, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, because they were published on low-cost paper duplication infrastructure that these institutions provided. Over time, though, as hobbyists disseminated through these communities, more college towns became publication hubs as the fan base of the older zines moved into the suburbs. Additionally, an analysis of publishing hubs over time shows a gradual migration to suburban and rural areas. In 1964, 9 of the 11 zines founded came from major urban centers, while 5 years later, in 1969, only 7 of the 37 new zines founded originated in urban centers. This data supports my general theory that hobbyists would migrate from suburban to urban spaces for college, often cultivating their interest in diplomacy through the college community, and then migrate back to the suburbs afterwards. The white wanderlust of hobbyists in their early 20s moving to urban centers for college and then returning to the suburbs maps almost perfectly onto a timeline of white flight, which was heavily influenced by desegregation policies like Truman's decision in 1948 to desegregate the military. But there's some interesting things here in how the suburban space was seen. I theorize that in more populous spaces, hobby game stores and the domestic play spaces of hobby games, basements, attics, and rec rooms were created in response to white flight. Of course, we have a tennis court on the top left of this image, the set of Mad Men on the top right, and Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons basement in the very bottom. I argue that the hobbyist situated himself apart from the discourse of hegemonic masculinity. He positioned himself outside of traditional leisure spaces of male work and leisure, the office, the bar, or the basketball court, yet within the predominantly feminine space of the home. Even so, the hobby networks he participates in allow him to simultaneously see himself within an insular like-minded network of white players. Hobbyists built a homogeneous, separate social sphere still pervaded by whiteness and a need for control. The politics of hobbyists in this network were varied, but marked nonetheless by what I assess as a key characteristic of whiteness, an arm's length understanding of civil rights. Hobbyists discuss civil protest through rhetorical distancing. Regardless of where the protest took place, it was described as a separate social sphere. In their discussions with one another, the Vietnam War works to whitewash and make invisible the Black protests around civil rights that were happening simultaneously, effectively rendering them invisible to the network, right? Civil protest means protest about war, not protest about civil rights at the time. The reach of the diplomacy fan network is broad and has important ramifications for understanding the infrastructural growth of hobby games in North America. This network reinforces the idea that the work of fans is often network building. It also draws attention to how many of these fans come from a homogenous cultural background. Although the lonely men within these networks were surely happy to find community of like-minded friends, they established a homogenous space within which the invisible premise of whiteness guided their design practice, reading interests, and political beliefs. To reinforce this point, we're going to look at a specific publishing loop in this hobbyist network, the New York Conspiracy. Here's a diplomacy fanzine that we're going to be looking at for this feedback. So although the New York region extends as far as eastern Pennsylvania, this particular constellation of players identified themselves as the New York Conspiracy. Its members were mainly high school and college students from the New York area who took an active role in the stewardship of the community in the years that followed. The opinions traded here were more left-leaning than those in the national community of hobbyists. And some well-known game designers like Greg Kostikian, author of Star Wars, the role-playing game, emerged from this scene. For these reasons, the context of the New York Conspiracy provides a contrast to the offensive right-wing provocations that made by some other members of the community that might have gone unchallenged in other publishing loops where there was an unspoken, more conservative consensus around appropriate conduct. I'm going to zoom in here with two conversations. One is going to be a conversation about hate speech and the censorship and whether or not the community should censor hate speech in these zines. And the other is a conversation around politics itself, right? What is political and what is not considered political? So I'm going to zoom in on those things as we continue through these slides. So the editors of New York Conspiracy zines were keen to put real-world political debate into its own section, separate from the mostly fictional press releases. In addition to sharing their strategic moves through the mail, diplomacy fans would role-play their in-game encounters with one another through short, often witty dispatches that satirized real-world press releases. So that's what they're talking about here, press releases. In one incident, two players, and I apologize, I'm going to have some strong language in the next 20 minutes of slides. So if you're easily offended by things, I just want to put that out there as a small trigger warning. In one incident, two players, Conrad Van Metzke and Duncan Smith, used the racial slur WAP and the term queen in a derogatory manner to refer to two other players, Edie Burzan and Evan Jones. This offensive behavior was called out by the Pouch's editor, Penelope Naughton-Dickens, obviously a woman. In an article on page 9 of the Pouch, entitled 31, entitled Censorship and the Press Release, Dickens advocates for the diplomacy fanzine editors to consider censoring press releases with racist and homophobic language. She queries, quote, yet these attacks, although not offensive to Burzan or Jones, to whom they were directed, could easily offend an Italian or a homosexual. What does an editor do in this case? For Dickens, the answer was that editors should censor offensive articles. Now, Dickens' admonishment spoke to how white privilege is framed as a conversation here around fun and politics. Conrad von Metzke, for example, suggested that fun be privileged by other hobbyists acting in the same space. In his response to Dickens, he sarcastically opposes fun to slander, libel, and viciousness within the community. To this point, he sardonically equates the fun of diplomacy to its, quote, most rational and pleasurable aspects, end quote. For instance, he valued, quote, brotherly interchange, mature reasoning, sensible toleration, and overall moderation. This was, of course, before using the term WAP to refer to fellow player Edie Burzan, which punctuated the sarcasm and therefore the effect of his joke. In the eyes of her community, Penelope Naughton-Dickens was guilty of transgressing the unspoken contract between players that yields an unencumbered space of play. Her call for censorship within the community was received with controversy and disdain precisely because she brought her real-world political beliefs into a space that was supposedly unencumbered by the political tethers of the real world. But despite von Metzke's exhortations, the conversation was quite political. It invoked the whiteness of all parties involved, both because Black players were completely absent from this discussion and because rationality was invoked as a way to discuss racism. Ultimately, the social isolation of the participants in this conversation drove their perceived anxiety relating to current events in the national political climate of North America. They did so in a way that clearly privileged the safe white activism of environmentalism as opposed to civil rights activism of the moment that the media connected to riots in the Black communities. In 1973, Dickens would quote fellow hobbyist E.D. Burzan in a description of Gary, Indiana, that was framed as environmental activism on the back pages of the Pouch. Quote, and this is what I have here, Gary, Indiana is a disgrace to humanity and a revolting spectacle of the ability of massive corporations to overpower the concerns for the health and clean air that miraculously work their way through our political system. The very thought of the town makes me sick. Unsaid and made invisible by this quote is the Black population of Gary, Indiana, a town that had made headlines a year earlier in 1972 for hosting the Black National Political Convention. And while the environmental activism that Dickens calls for is left-leaning, it is clear from her tone that she regards the town and the Black people who live in it as if they were in another world entirely. These fans saw themselves as outsiders to contemporary activism around race in America, and as such embodied white privilege through their naivete. By situating race as a point of white discussion and remarking on their fears of a, quote, chaotic, end quote, nation, diplomacy fans participated in what Douglas Toner would refer to as, quote, massification, where Black people, poor people, and other minoritized communities are seen as disordered and aggressive mob bent on challenging the status quo of white values. So simultaneous to the correspondence regarding the censorship of hate speech within other fan publications, the editorial board of the Pouch at the time, Penelope Dickens, Duncan Smith, and Nicholas Ulanov, published a series of articles regarding the impeachment of President Nixon. In Pouch 33, the editors issue a statement that evinces their ultimate support for the impeachment of Nixon. Following that statement were a number of details listing best practices for getting in touch with local congresspeople and taking an active role in petitioning for Nixon's removal. While the statement certainly did not necessarily indicate a strong sense of partisanship on the part of the editorial board, by October 1973, most Americans were unified in their dislike of Nixon. It showcased the Pouch's unique propensity in hobby gaming towards activism and political commentary. In the next issue of the Pouch, however, the editors were far more explicit in their rationale for Nixon's impeachment. First, they reprinted a 2.5-page ad where the ACLU, showing where the ACLU stood on the issue and petitioned for donations towards his impeachment. It described a laundry list of problems, including wiretapping, espionage, perjury, burglary, dragnet arrests, and the 3-year secret bombing of Cambodia, a politically neutral country at the time. So given the Pouch's relatively sizable distribution and the absence of contestation within its letters section, it's safe to say that these points reflected the beliefs of many of its subscribers as well. Why else would they subscribe or continue subscribing? One editor of the Pouch, Nicholas Ulanov, supplemented this advertisement with an editorial entitled "Why I'm for Impeachment." In this editorial, he revealed that he worked for McGovern's 1972 campaign against Nixon, which suggested that he was likely a Democrat. Ulanov alludes here several times to the chaos of anarchy and the virtues of the American political system. Thus, he equates the race riots that were a recent memory in 1973 with anarchy and contrasts them with the top-down and white form of traditional American governance. Ulanov's rhetoric, which positioned the race riots as chaos, spoke to how hobbyists saw themselves as outside of Black issues and how acutely Black protests threatened their way of life. In discussing the Nixon presidency, Ulanov made frequent use of the terms evil and chaos, perhaps representing his fear of how the social order was being undermined. Ulanov elaborates here on the discord that he believed would follow Nixon's impeachment. Quote, I also felt that the company would be put through total governmental chaos and that the current moment of history, this country had to avoid all chaos at such cost. I based this belief that the process would be extremely dirty on the events that followed President Johnson's impeachment. In addition, I was afraid that perhaps I and many of my friends were being too harsh on Nixon, and in the event of impeachment would be judged in the way the radical Republicans were after the Johnson fiasco. It is now generally felt that the Johnson matter was totally unwarranted and a great miscarriage of justice. Johnson was acquitted by only 1 vote in the Senate, and his heroic senator, Edmund G. Ross, never held political office again after voting the way his conscience and not his constituents dictated. Ulenov's reverence here for the American Constitution was apparent. Several times he repeated his belief that problems in American politics were due to corrupted participants rather than systemic failure. Additionally, Ulanov alluded to a general unease with the structural chaos that stems from a leaderless nation. He brought up fear of disorder again at the end of the editorial. In the final paragraph, Ulanov reiterated the strength of America's Constitution. Then, using Truman's firing of General MacArthur as an example, he explains that the sense of democratic deliberation was, in fact, the American system's saving grace, and suggests that it helped prevent World War III. He wrote, quote, Truman's firing of MacArthur. MacArthur wanted to attack China, which may have well cost World War III, end quote. According to Ulanov, not only did American checks and balances help prevent World War III, had the same episode occurred in a parliamentarian system, MacArthur's removal from office would have led to the systemic collapse of government. Ulanov repeats several times in this editorial that it's chaos he is most concerned with. This fear is particular to domestic politics, both the speculative chaos of impeachment and the perceived anarchy of Black protest. American exceptionalism in this context was compatible with Ulanov's greatest fears. And so his perspective shows us how whiteness was navigated by liberal hobbyists in the game space. For Ulanov and other like-minded hobbyists, the gaming community was a space for political campaigning where feelings about civil chaos could be shared with sympathetic readers. And although Ulanov did not tread deeply into a debate about censorship the way Dickens did, it is clear his thinking was animated by a white anxiety around civil unrest and corrupted politicians. We can contrast his ideas with contemporaneous civil rights conversations that were being had at the time by readers such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who characterized American democracy as a dictatorship for Black folk, and more radically, Malcolm X, who said at the Solomon Baptist Church in Detroit that, quote, the government itself has failed us and that white liberals who had been passing us as our friends have failed us, end quote. Ulanov's view that American democracy could still work for the American people spoke directly to his white positionality, given his simultaneous concern in the Black community that American democracy had failed them. So here's where it gets dark. If Ulanov epitomized the white liberal approach to politics, others in the New York conspiracy, like Robert Lipton, were decidedly more conservative. Lipton felt that games were fundamentally apolitical and wanted to keep the game space separate from the, quote, real spaces of politics. His zine, the Mixu Maxu Gazette, was never as explicitly political as the Pouch. Within the gaming hobbyist community, it became known for its satirical tone. First published in 1973, the Mixu Maxu Gazette was published with several lighthearted slogans on the paper's header, playing on the idea of a high-quality objective journalism. The paper ran as a, quote, quantity publication and all the press unfit to print. Lipton clearly did not take himself too seriously as a publisher or editor and only occasionally inserted political commentary into his zine. Notably, the first issue ran a quick blurb about Watergate at its very end, which noted why Lipton had grown bored with the discussion of Watergate in the news. Unlike Ulanov, who had tried to rally his distribution network around the issue, Lipton evinced a paranoia that Nixon had taken control of the news media. Quote, but perhaps this was planned. The over-interesting gradually fading off to ennui. This is what Nixon wants. A frightening idea, but we're growing tired of being frightened, aren't we? Significantly, in this one candid moment, Lipton noted a general fear he felt within the community. Here, like Ulanov, Lipton was particularly nostalgic in the above quote, for government without corruption. But if Ulanov's commentary came from a desire to return to an idealized form of American democracy, Lipton, in contrast, was producing a space for conservative discourse within the Mixu Maxu Gazette. This is Karl Hess. Lipton shows how a libertarian stance towards free speech and expression can overlap with what might be assessed today as a white supremacist worldview. At the time, a burgeoning libertarian movement, spearheaded by Goldwater speechwriter Karl Hess, was activated recruiting both leftist anarchists and right-leaning hippies with anti-authoritarian values. Specifically, Hess encouraged his supporters to distrust the government. The libertarian values of Hess dovetailed with talking points around individual freedom that simultaneously circulated in the conservative media. The American libertarian during this period adopted a mindset of white privilege that was most commonly articulated by what I would say, saying absolutely anything that came to mind, regardless of whose feelings might be hurt in doing so. So Lipton's writing epitomized the right-leaning libertarian sentiment of the moment then. Weary of political discourse in the New York conspiracy and the news media, Lipton wrote a nihilistic and offensive commentary on politics for the Mixu Gazette, where he referred to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as, I apologize for this, but a quote, pushy nigger. In a December 1973 article, If You Loved Harpo, Honk Your Horn, Lipton called for the formation of the quote, Marxist Party of America and nominated Harpo Marx for president. In listing Marx's virtues, Lipton glibly extolled that candidates should, quote, never have said anything with which anyone could disagree, end quote, and quote, should be dead. Marx, one of the famous Marx brothers who early in his career played in many silent films, fit the bill. Particularly offensive here is the rant that Lipton embarked on when describing why he desired a dead candidate. In it, he offered unambiguously racist commentary about the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And again, I apologize for the slurs here. The candidate should be dead. Think of how despised politicians became noble statesmen as soon as they're in their graves. Didn't you despise the Kennedy brothers until they were killed? Wasn't Martin Luther King a pushy nigger until 1968? Didn't the New York Times, which hated Johnson while he lived, give him a beautiful obituary? Wasn't Lincoln, who couldn't control his Congress and told jokes at the worst possible times, elected to godhood? Lipton's offensive, carefree, and racist tone epitomized libertarian sentiment within the hobbyist community. Here, the invisible power dynamic of whiteness empowered Lipton to say whatever he liked because of an idealist understanding of First Amendment rights that didn't extend to hate speech in the realm of satire. Clearly, the civil rights movement was frightening to Lipton, writing from the relative isolation of Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. His hateful remarks about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, and even Lincoln constitute a pattern of racism that aligns well with what is described today as white supremacy. Lipton's examples also show how the white isolationism of suburban life flavored his political views and how his cloistered college environment did very little to expose him to other perspectives. Lipton adorned his zines with news excerpts that stoked paranoia and fear. Like the perspectives on social chaos espoused by Ulanov, they portrayed America as a dangerous and lawless space that was rapidly spiraling out of control. The racially homogenous hobbyist community, in contrast, could be controlled. This made it an ideal space for white libertarian opinions to run amok. Although Lipton rarely wrote overtly political pieces, he would frequently retype excerpts from interesting news articles as filler at the end of pages. In issue 3 of the Gazette, he published 2 articles at the end of the letters section, one related to corrupt police officers and the other on civil turmoil in Oklahoma. Quote, McAlester, Oklahoma, August 2nd, sharpshooters with rifles stood on rooftops, Lipton transcribed, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary with orders to kill if necessary to prevent further bloodshed. Support Peach or I'll kill you. Not only were these dispatches nostalgic for an imaginary world free of chaos, they were also racially charged. Lipton, an avid newsreader, was certainly aware of the burgeoning prisoners' rights movement that had sparked the death of George Jackson, a black man, 2 years earlier in San Quentin prison. Jackson's death sparked protests in prisons across America, including Attica Correctional Facility in New York, and later McAlester Prison in Oklahoma. The prisoners' rights movement was inspirational to Angela Davis, who said in a 1972 speech in Los Angeles, quote, and in doing this, the prison movement must be integrated into our struggles for Black and Brown liberation and to our struggles for an end to material want and need, end quote. The characterization and publicization of these protests as bloodshed furthered a white supremacist worldview that stereotypes prisoners as poor and or Black to pigeonhole them as an unruly mob. Lipton believed in a white libertarian worldview where he had the freedom and social mobility to say whatever he wanted while others, specifically Black people, did not. As noted earlier, Cruz points out the juxtaposition of racism with a dialogue around freedom and the rights of individuals was swiftly picking up momentum during this period as a set of conservative talking points. Lipton brought into this ideology whole hog. He evinced it not only through his writing, but also through his memeing of news articles related to chaotic and turbulent Cold War America within the Mixu Gazette. So, to close, right? The New York conspiracy was a space of white discourse, motivated by a liberalist white guilt at one end of the political spectrum and a white libertarian approach to free speech at the other. As a microcosm of the hobbyist community, the New York conspiracy demonstrated how the language used could at best be read as a series of microaggressions by Black people looking to participate. At worst, it was an explicitly white supremacist space of discourse that maintained a sense of white purity within its boundaries. While New York Conspiracy stands as an example of how the hobbyist community understood its relationship to white identity, it is important to recognize that this network was not isolated. The conversations that were held in the greater hobbyist community moved between social spaces. In these pages, high school students learned from political activists and military strategists, who in turn gleaned tips from high school students. So a key takeaway from all of this is that, as Tara McPherson implies in her writing about the racialized separation between culture and code, the absence of an understanding or dialogue about civil rights in America within these zines fundamentally defines their white identity. The fallout of segregationist policies and the ensuing white flight of desegregation led to a hobbyist identity that enjoyed the privilege of whiteness, not by addressing blackness, or even worse, only addressing it through, let me read that again. The fallout of segregationist policies and the ensuing white flight of desegregation led to a unique hobbyist identity that enjoyed the privileges of whiteness by not addressing blackness, or even worse, only addressing blackness through slurs and pejorative language. Importantly, this research helps us to understand how hobbyists and geeks alike have historically aligned themselves with white privilege, and in doing so, taken extraordinary steps to situate conversations about race as political and thus set apart from the leisurely domain of fun and games, which they felt should be read as apolitical and thus neutral in orientation. These historical moments have lasting impacts as we consider the rationale behind the radicalization of white identity today within geek culture, on message boards online, in survivalist and prepper communities, and other spaces where outsider interests of hobbyists pit an armed, aggressive, and violent set of men against a rapidly diversifying modern American society. And finally, I want to take a brief moment to return to the example with which I began. The point here is not to point out how board games today are implicated in a history of white flight and racism. Instead, I want to point out how the normalization and dissemination of these themes, even amongst allies within the hobby game community, has been part of a larger story about geek culture coming to terms with its own history. As a new cohort of woke and increasingly diverse geeks comes to take center stage in the game industry today, the old guard of hobbyists increasingly radicalized through the same discourse around freedoms and liberties that they did in the 1970s. And I believe that this is also happening in other hobby communities today. So thank you all for your time and for listening to me. And I'm so excited to take your questions and conversation because, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is kind of fresh new work. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thank
Great
you.
Talk. Great talk. So yeah, I'm happy to help field questions in the chat for Trammell, or you can raise your hand. I can on you. Yeah, you can unmute and ask a question. I think you should be able. Cheryl, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Zach.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. That was awesome. A lot to think about. I guess my main question is, what is it about white suburban life that creates this sort of outsider sensibility that's rooted in or that is supported by white supremacy? I guess I just don't understand what the argument is exactly. Of course, I just had my second vaccination yesterday, so I'm blaming everything on that. Everything I don't understand today is because of that brain fog. So I guess my question, I hope it's clear. I guess there's so many other things that could be correlated, right? Like the kind of education you get in a white suburban high school that would make you be blind to Black history in the US, for example, or that would keep you from even understanding what slavery was all about in a worldwide scope. So if you could just talk a little bit about what do the suburbs have to do? What kind of evidence do you have? What, all of that. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks.
That's a great question. If I seem a little addled, I apologize. Also, I quit coffee this week, and it's been really great for my anxiety, but it's also given me a lot of migraines, and it's made me a little dizzy sometimes. So I'm on the tail end of that, so I'm feeling a little better right now. So that's an excellent question, and one that I think really does merit a good deal of conversation. So there's a few answers to it. I think one of the first and clearest answers, right, is information bubbles, right? So when you live in a suburb, especially in the 60s or 70s where there was less social media and we didn't find our information bubbles online, the information bubbles were offline, right? Like it was your community, it was the 7 people in your neighborhood that you interact with. And because we know demographically, and this is where Kevin Cruz's excellent work on white flight and white privilege comes in, we know demographically that, you know, there was a mass migration in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of, and even going on until today, of white people into the suburbs. What happens then is you have an information bubble that isn't necessarily highlighting certain activities and is highlighting other activities, right? Right, and this is the playbook for radicalizing white communities today. This happens on Breitbart. It's not about putting out white supremacist articles, which they might do, but it's about filtering the information to your audience so they only get the articles that highlight white supremacy and white supremacist ideas in a particular way, right? And so when you have a community that's not exposed to other ideas about what social justice might be, that creates a sort of monoculture, and that kind of incubates the sort of politics of white privilege that I tried to articulate through empirical examples of it happening in the historical moment. So I think that is the answer to that question, but it's complicated, and I don't think it's necessarily totally causal. I think it has a lot to do with environment and the other people in the environment of the suburbs at the time.
I got
One question.
yeah, I've got a question in the chat here. Even being something of a linguistic sociologist, in your talk about flight, made me wonder about the conceptualization of flight, I guess the idea of flight, and whether the inclusivity movements in hobby spaces, which are themselves opposition like masculinity, might cause individuals who are into game or masculinity to leave hobbies, or maybe silo with like-minded individuals and be participating deniers in the hobby in hopes that things will go back to normal. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a great first, it's a lot of thoughts, and I want to get to it correctly. So if you need me to clarify anything after this question, please ask. So this is just one chapter of the work, and I kind of structured it because I wanted to show a deep dive of how libertarianism, whiteness, and stuff incubated in the suburbs and bring that out to the conversation. But I have another whole chapter on the hobby game scene today that I think gets into this conversation a little better. And so what I would say you have in the hobby game scene today is a tension between what I would call geeks, which are the new guard of hobbyists, and hobbyists, who are the old guard of hobbyists. And the geeks are woke. The geeks really want to bring social justice into the games. They want representation there. They've been, this is what they see their work as doing. And the old guard, on the other hand, are far more conservative. They have this tie to the communities that I'm describing in this presentation. And the old guard of hobbyists, although they're not necessarily going to say, we don't want Black people in this community, they will say, Black people are welcome here, they just don't come, right? And so they're not looking to open the door, they're just saying inclusivity means saying we are welcoming and stuff like that. And that's tied to that sort of libertarian ethic of like, you just do what you will in this space. So returning to your question, I think the tension that's happening today between the two groups of hobbyists is that you have this old guard that really thinks it's welcoming, inclusive, even though it's not. But the one thing that they have done is they've got all these small cottage networks built around the distribution and production of the games they make. And these cottage networks have been insulated in a lot of ways from the market and neoliberalism. So that special place they made is really their special place. Whereas on the other side, the sort of new guard of geeks coming into the hobby are creating alliances with bigger companies that are trying to sell more and more games and really move into the commercial space of gaming. You see this with Wizards of the Coast that does Dungeons and Dragons and Magic cards. You see this with Asmodee, which is the biggest board game distributor in the world at the moment. They're trying to really, really put on an inclusive front, and they really want to control that hobby space of gaming. So I'd say that's kind of the tension that's happening in the community right now, right? Like, is between inclusivity and control over the product through these older practices. So I think that's where the conversation is at today. And yeah, I do think that some people are siloing them off because they feel targeted by the new crowd of geeks that are coming in, and maybe rightly so.
Thank you. And we have a question from James. James watching all the way from the West Coast. I really like the way you've connected geographic factors like suburbanization with the politics of white supremacy in hobby gaming. Do you have any thoughts on what we see today? Employment opportunities in urban centers led young privileged populations locate into the very same cities and neighborhoods that their parents previously had left behind. At the same time, much of gaming has moved online. How has this affected the politics of gaming and gaming identities?
Yeah, I think it's more complicated today. I mean, so I think, you know, I think you're talking about gentrification here, and I think part of the question that's happening in this question is, are gentrifying urban communities still part of the white flight we're describing? Is that correct, James?
I guess that could be part of it, but I suppose what I really want to know is just if this sort of suburban urban divide coupled with the shift to online gaming has produced any unique political effects that this sort of lens you've introduced here of looking for like a correlation between geographic factors and the politics of gaming could sort of reveal to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I really thought-provoking one. So I'm sorry if I'm what's it called, stalling a little, because I'm trying to get my thoughts in order because it's a big one. I think one of the things with online gaming today is that we don't necessarily see the dynamics of white flight playing out in the same way, or suburbanization playing out the same way. So I would assume at least one byproduct of suburbanization, right, is access to technology today, right? If you live in the suburbs, it's likely that you have a computer in your home. It's likely that you have access to broadband internet, and you can get online to play the game. Whereas in an urban community, those wouldn't be assumptions I would make. In fact, I'd probably assume that your access to internet would be through your mobile device, and that's a totally different conversation around games and gaming, and a totally different part of the games and gaming industry. In fact, when you look at industry breakdowns of what gaming looks like today, there's been a huge shift towards mobile gaming. That's where a huge portion of the industry has migrated. And the traditional white male gamer, 18 to 35, that used to occupy the sort of console and computer gaming demographic is no longer the main target of most gaming companies. So I think that's part of that conversation of how to locate it, right? Like, is where are people playing the games? And they probably are playing it at least half in the urban spaces through mobile devices, and that's part of what's going on. But in terms of the politics that influences identities, I don't know. I wonder if I wonder if those online spaces. So there's two things, right? Like, you can see the same exact conversations happening in those online spaces as you see happening in the zines I've pointed out. Kishonna Gray, in her excellent work on Black gamers, has some great full quotes looking at Black gamers playing in online spaces, getting into arguments where people use slurs, and getting kind of like scared away from participating in those communities because of the toxic hate speech in them, and not feeling like they can come in to moderate that. So that dynamic is still replicated in gaming communities today. But I don't know if it's as geographically tied as what we could see back in the day, except insofar as to do chat probably means that you have broadband computer access, which means that it's more likely that you're at least in an urban space or the suburb, probably a wealthy urban space or the suburbs. So I guess some correlation might happen in that regard. But that's a really deep and interesting question, and I'd like to learn more about it too.
Thanks.
Cool. We got a question from Jamie. I may have missed this at the beginning, but I was wondering what archives hold the pouch zines. Love to see and think about times and medium of the zine and newsletter printed and mimeographed or Xerox, so the materiality of it. Love your talk. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that question, Jamie. So there, no, you guys all still here?
I'm still here. I think everybody else is too.
Yes, there are a few archives. One is at University of Riverside that has an archive of hobby gaming zines, but the one I went to was at Bowling Green State University, which is far farther away from where we are here. And they have a special collection on diplomacy fanzines. That was the main place I went to look for these fanzines and to look through them. Although I will say that there are also some online sites where people host collections of these fanzines, probably illegally. So I've definitely looked at some zines through those sites. And the last place, I didn't use any of this work in this presentation today, but there is a very famous Dungeons and Dragons fanzine from LA called Alarms and Excursions. And I actually had to purchase all of the copies from the publisher because she doesn't want them distributed digitally. And so she asked that I pay $2 a copy for every copy and then not distribute the PDF. So that was kind of neat to get it that way. And yeah, I guess it was like $400. It was kind of a steal to get all those fanzines. Yeah, they're in different spots, but these dip zines were definitely at Bowling Green State University archive, the Hoosier archive, which is amazing.
Yeah, actually, I have a little follow-up question on Jamie's. Sort of, if you could say about your methodology in terms of, you mentioned some of the archives. Are you influenced by some book history approaches and sort of mapping communication networks? How do you collect your data and sort of seek out these phenomena that you're tracking here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I alluded to this in the start of the talk, but I'm really influenced by Foucauldian genealogy. I don't do many interviews. And so one of the things that Foucault does in genealogy is he tries not to interview people because he's afraid or concerned that by interviewing somebody, you risk interpolating your material through their lens of the present, right? So you risk bringing in a lens that might be rose tinted when in fact things weren't all that rosy back in the day. So I really try to stick to primary sources only, and I really try to just look at it and look at the material I'm going at and through in the archive, and see what stories the participants in them tell me as a reader, in order to kind of highlight and pick up on some of those moments of conflict that are within it, which I think reveal a lot about the culture and the community at the time. That said, I also am influenced by some book history approaches. Zach asked that question, although we shared an advisor at Rutgers. It was very big in book history. And I think one of the things that book history, which is not necessarily that famous a field, does in a really interesting way, is it gets into what the materiality of these sources means, right? Like when you're looking at a source, how do you date that by looking at the way it's folded, the way it's copied and stuff like that? And so, fortunately, many of the archivists at the Hoosier Archive had already done that dating work for me when I got to it. But there have definitely been times that I've had to look at documents and tried to kind of piece together through the folds of materiality the kind of story it's had, for better or for worse. And that's definitely part of the sort of research that working in archives has and the fun of it. But I would definitely say, if you put a document from the 60s or 70s in front of me, and you had an opportunity to go to an actual archivist to talk to about they do a much better job gating it and understanding the history through materiality than I could. But it's interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for the
And-
question.
Any other questions? Or I have a couple more if no one else does. I guess I'll ask them then. I wonder if you could, and hopefully this isn't too in the weeds here, but talk a little bit about the game diplomacy and how much the game mechanics and sort of the themes of the game may play into these communication networks that you're looking at here, and these themes that come out of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, so the way diplomacy works is that it's a map of Eastern of Europe during World War I. Everybody has tokens on the map representing armies or boats or navies, and the hook, the most interesting part of the game, is that it doesn't go sequentially around the table as you take turns. Everybody takes turns simultaneously. And so that means that you might all secretly write down on a piece of paper, I'm going to move into this square. And then when you reveal your pieces of paper, suddenly all the armies are in Germany. And there's a big war with many parties, with many alliances in Germany at the time. And then when the dust clears, you work out who gets what and what gets who, right? So it's known infamously in friend communities as a game that ruins friendships, because there's lots of backstabbing, betrayal, and sort of back alley deals happening. But it's also a war game, right? Like you're moving armies around on a map, and although there's not really math involved besides like +1, -1, you are moving armies around on a map and trying to control space. So that's how diplomacy works. And so I think part of the question you're asking is, how does that game reflected into the conversations that I'm seeing here around white privilege and white supremacy? The biggest tie, and this is it's funny things that become important here. So the most important thing is that diplomacy requires 7 players. There's 7 countries that are active in the game of diplomacy. So to have a full table, which is the amount of players that people want to usually play with, you need 7 people. And so when this game was released in like 1963, it got released in all these stores, a lot of kids would go out, buy a copy of Diplomacy, and then quickly realize that they didn't have 7 friends who were willing to sit down for a 6 or 8 hour game of Diplomacy. And so this is kind of the catalyst that gets the whole hobby community going, right? Like suddenly all of these people had this game that they really, really were excited to play, that they were reading about in this magazine they were buying that was distributed in the same stores that Avalon Hill General, but no friends to play it with. And so the Avalon Hill General, and I showed a slide earlier in my slide list, had a column called Opponents Wanted, and Opponents Wanted was a way to find other friends out there who wanted to play that game with you. And so that's how this Play by Now network really got started, was people who didn't have enough friends in their local communities reaching out to create fanzines and to forge networks with friends in other spaces and areas where they could play diplomacy and basically form a network of ideas with those friends. So I think that's the real place that it overlaps. The other side, which is like the war game side of it, I actually don't think with the story I told today, I see much overlap. As I kind of talked, one of the politics that a lot of the people in these zines could get behind was the sort of anti-war movement that you saw. So like, in one sense, right, this is typical late 60s, early 70s counterculture, really trying to just, get against war and stuff like that. And so even though they're playing diplomacy, they were still, for the most part, maybe not Robert Lipton, the last guy I talked about, anti-war. So I think that's one of the things to look at there also, which is that I don't think the war game-ness happened. But then on the final level, which were the press releases, which were the role-playing aspect, I think for some of the players, the fun of the game, I think you see kind of like these, I don't know, bombastic performances of like different characters and personas that they would create that really resonate within like the community of players and gamers today, that you could imagine on like an online board like World of Warcraft and stuff like that, kind of being similar to the chat. But yeah, the situatedness in World War One, less so. But I do have an addendum to that, if you don't mind me talking for another second. And that's the some of my other research in a different chapter, not on this community, not on diplomacy players, but on the Avalon Hill General, goes into the sort of games that Avalon Hill players were really interested in playing. And this is where it gets interesting, because there was a game called Africa Corps, and there was a game called Gettysburg that were tremendously popular in the Avalon Hill community. And in Gettysburg, right, it's the Battle of Gettysburg, and Africa Corps, it's battles in early World War II North Africa. And often the heroes of these stories for the hobbyists were Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, and Erwin Rommel, who is, for lack of a better description, if you're not a World War II history buff, but Robert E. Lee, but Nazi, right? Like the general that the Nazis, that did the right thing, that was honorable in all these different ways, but was still in fact a Nazi. And so you've got all these commentaries in the general about playing Rommel, playing Lee, how great it's to kill those Yankees. And later you get covers from these magazines that I just have to show this because it's so wild, are essentially like glamour shots of Hitler. And so I think it's pretty clear from some of that material that this white supremacy was, that's Rommel, right? So these were covers from the Avalon Hill General. And this one just like blows my mind completely. Like this is from the 80s in the Avalon Hill General, but this is what the hobbyist community grows into, is a place that would be casually putting publications like this, you know, no big deal, just in hobby game stores saying, okay, these were great generals, right? These were interesting wars. And then there's one more that I'd show. This is an earlier one, because this was another thing, sort of denialism. Who really started World War II, right? So there's whole articles that like excavate the history of World War II and start talking about, you know, how maybe Germany wasn't really at fault for starting World War II or anything like that. So there's a whole deep history of white supremacy within the Avalon Hill General, just not necessarily within the diplomacy fanzine communities, probably within other fanzines of the generals.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Really interesting thing about these different levels in your research is sort of the micro game mechanics, but also the sort of way in which information about the game circulates across these communities. The interplay between that. Very cool. We got another question here. Let's see, from Stephen. It's interesting. It's interesting now that I think about it, how the counterargument in games, when people bring in issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., that people are making it too political, in quotes, or the refrain, it's just a game. It speaks to the privilege of being able to separate your personal existence from social spaces, fields of practice, something not afforded to women or minorities. But reinforcing gaming culture is, in itself, truly political by erasing these discussions. That just came to me based on your talk. So more of a comment on that question, but maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, and you that's where the conversation's at, right? Like, so politics becomes an object of discussion in so many ways, right? Where politics gets coded as anything that is not white, right? Like politics becomes talking about race. So talking about race shouldn't be political. Talking about gender, talking about the experience that you have as a woman playing a game or as a Black man playing a game should not be political. That wouldn't necessarily be a political conversation, but that does become a conversation in gaming communities we have today. And I speak at that in depth in the conversation about, right, like inclusive geeks in the community today, which are more inclusive versus hobbyists, which have this more conservative ethos. Well, I want to link it to right now and make more concrete links to right now is the libertarian mindset that you really see incubated in the hobby game community in the 1960s and 70s, right? So this is why I brought in the Hess. I forget his first name off the top of my head, but I brought in that slide with something Hess. Carl Hess, Goldwater's advisor, right? So this libertarianism kind of got incubated as a political strategy for Republican operatives in the 60s. And what it did was it created an alliance, right? It was coalition building between very right-wing conservatives, but also right-leaning hippies who are just anti-authoritarian, right? And so this is a really interesting coalition that gets built on the right in the 1960s that I think we're still finding ramifications of today. And one of those things that that coalition really believes in is that this idea of politics is only about like presidents. It's only about like foreign policy. It's only about military policy or diplomacy, foreign diplomacy. It's never about civil rights. It's never about protests. It's never about the domestic. And so I think that finding those concrete linkages between libertarian thinkers in the 60s and 70s and the hobbyist communities really reveals a lot about how and why people are still having the same conversation today. So that's part of the picture. And then the other part of it, and this is another part in this chapter that I just didn't have time to get to, but there were conservative radio hosts also espousing these libertarian policies that really bought into these libertarian policies in the 1960s that had direct ties to the KKK and other like explicitly white supremacist groups. So it's not just that it's libertarianism, it's that there were some really, really concrete ties between this particular libertarian movement and momentum and white supremacist groups. So it's a little bit of both things happening. And I think that's how you see these ideas kind of blooming over time into the nightmares that we're dealing with today, right?
Okay, cool. I think we maybe have time for one more question. Well, anyone wants to build on anything we've talked about, or I think I'll throw out one last little question just in the time that we have, and maybe and ask you just to make some connections to maybe offer some advice for students in game design programs today, let's say, at universities or in other contexts. What your research in this talk, but also sort of broadly, if there's some takeaways that game designers who are nascent game designers can sort of use to grow.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Thanks, Zach. So at UC Irvine, I'm in the Department of Informatics, and one of the reasons I'm here is that we have a game design major that a lot of students come into, and so we try to recruit a lot of people who do game design specifically. So I'm the critical theory end of the group. There's others that do more design stuff and are much better at speaking to design practices. But I can tell you the one thing that I know just from teaching the classes I teach, and that's that all the students that come in with dreams to be aspiring game designers have not played enough games. They just haven't. And you know, I think to really get good at game design, you just have to play and consume a variety of different games, right? Like you have to put yourself out of your comfort zone. You have to seek out games that you might not have sought in other genres. If you don't like rhythm games, you should play a rhythm game. If you don't like role-playing games, you should play a role-playing game. If you love role-playing games and you want to design role-playing games, maybe you should play a fighting game. Maybe you should play Uno, right? Like I think that by playing more games, people open themselves up to more diverse mindsets in terms of design, and it really helps to make better games overall. And then to kind of go into like the indie worlds that like I operate in when I talk to game designers in the hobby game community, you know, the same goes there, right? It's not just that homogeneity is by genre, it's also by designer and by community that design works in. So there's lots of BIPOC designers and women designers who are really, really putting out excellent stuff these days, but you're not going to find it, and this sounds really elitist, right? And snobby, you're not going to find it at your local hobby store, your comic store. You've got to go online, you've got to do some research. There's some great zines out there, like I think one's called More Seats at the Table, that does like a monthly rundown of different games by marginalized creators. Just really wonderful stuff out there that really can help you broaden the scope of what you're thinking about within games. And so I think just trying to play more games and from a more diverse set of designers can just really open one's eyes. And then the other thing, and this is also just because I hang out with a lot of indie people who do indie design, is also play the big games, right? Like you can't ignore the big games. That's the cultural conversation we're having today. So you just have to play all the games. So that's what I would say. Great question.
Thanks, Aaron. That's great advice. It's kind of like any art form or design context. You want to have as many uses, be it cinema or literature. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it would be like being an aspiring cinematographer and then saying like, I really like Terminator 2, so I just watched all the James Cameron movies. I will not watch other movies.
Right.
And that is often how students come to game design.
Yeah. And there's no excuse now. I mean, it's not the same as when growing up and you had one store in Red Bank, New Jersey that you had access to. Now you have networks that go beyond your physical location. Cool. Well, this is really great talk, and I think we'll wrap it up unless there's other questions from the audience that are still lingering. Otherwise, thank you so much, Aaron. Really appreciate it. Round of applause. Always awesome. And hopefully we can have you come in person next time.
Yeah, I would love that. And thank you all for being so supportive. This was really fun, and it gave me a lot of things to think about as I go and keep on writing this stuff. So thank you so much. All right, folks.
All right.
Thank
See ya.
you.